Yeah. And that leads us to the real crux of the today, which is Singapore. This is the one that it's the race that it's a bit of a cockroach. It just keeps coming back to bite you in the arse because it happened
Yeah.
and we were like, oh well, this is cool. You know, it's a new track. It's a street circuit first night race. First race is pretty crazy. Nobody really. I don't remember thinking, oh, this looks a bit suspect when everything happened. I think Martin Brundle did. I think he did say in commentary in the race. There's a clip of him being like, it's very convenient that through all this, it's PK's teammate that's ended up coming out in the lead when he was miles behind before. So he was onto
Yeah.
it. But then obviously it was a year later when PK got fired that he suddenly revealed, oh, yeah, they ordered me to crash. And then all of that kicks off. And then it just becomes one of those funny things you remember, part of the history. And then Massa launches this lawsuit to try and overturn the result because he
Yeah.
then discovered, because Bernie Ecclestone revealed that he and Max Mosley both knew about what had happened at the time, but didn't say anything because they didn't want to damage the sport. Because I think things were already looking a bit shaky because of Spygate as well, and that sort of thing. It was a bit of a tumultuous time for Formula One.
Yeah. Look, this race was a disgrace. But before we get into it, why would they cancel the result of the race? Why not just throw out the cheater? I mean, yes, the race was manipulated, but at the end of the day, I don't see why the other drivers who drove very well, like Rosberg, like Vettel, should have their result thrown out. It just seems a bit harsh. Keep in
Mm.
mind, Ferrari made a mistake, and Massa had spun in the race before then. People forget he spun under the bridge.
Mm.
So Felipe drove yet again with the fastest car yet again. I don't think he drove his finest race. And yet again, Ferrari operationally, as I mentioned before in this podcast, were atrocious. You can't just, yes, someone cheated. Renault were disgusting. Flavio Briatore was up to his antics again. Nelson Piquet Jr. has no backbone. Agreed. But you can't just forgive the mistakes Ferrari made as well. I don't think that is fair. I don't think that's in the spirit of competition. And I'm not prepared to penalize Rosberg and the rest of them who drove Rosberg, Vettel, Heidfeld, who drove the wheels off their car. Why should they have their results canceled because of Renault? Throw Renault out. Take out one of Alonso's wins.
I mean,
Now
obviously, the reason their lawyers aren't doing that is because that increases Hamilton's winning margin. They want the race result overturned because that's the only way that Massa can take the time. Because
anyways, I mean,
any other scenario just gives Hamilton more points.
yeah, anyways, it's just ridiculous. I mean, the race itself was somewhat entertaining. I think Raikkonen crashed out trying to push at the end. That was disappointing. Just more misery.
Mm.
It was a depressing time to be a Kimi fan. But then there were some stellar drives in that race. Rosberg was absolutely sensational. I mean, Nico Rosberg should have won that race, in my opinion. He drove the wheels off that car. There's a good chance Massa might have won it despite his spin. And I think that ultimately, on a track that yet again, I know Ferrari had the quickest car, you had a Renault winning, Williams second, what a drive by Rosberg, and Hamilton third. So again, like you can say Hamilton did not have his finest season, but you see when Ferrari are dropping the ball, at least Hamilton is there. And at least McLaren aren't making such stupid mistakes as not removing a fuel hose or having a car that's like having the engine blow up in Hungary and in Valencia. McLaren were just better operationally, making the right strategy calls, and they had a more consistent driver. And this race was yet another example of that. I don't care how badly Nelson Piquet cheated. Why isn't McLaren beating both Ferraris this race? Why are you crashing, Kimi?
Yeah, it
You know,
was when I was watching it live. It was one of those things where I remember the first stint there wasn't really much happening until PK's crash, and that was what kicked everything off. In the same way that Germany was nothing was happening until Glock crashed, and that triggered a safety car.
yeah,
Wasn't Raikkonen like insanely fast in the first sector, in the first stint, even in this race? I think he'd had a well,
yeah,
he'd had a bad start, but was catching them at a rate of knots. Hamilton and Massa.
yeah.
Um,
Was, and he was generally insanely fast in the final part of all the races in 2008 because the car setup would shift once his rear tires got worn and he was on low fuel to a more oversteer feel.
yeah,
But it was just too little too late. I mean, you know, in this race, he just made a driving error. And his speed is not in question at that point. It was more like he was so. I think he was just in a really bad place, probably mentally, just thinking like, I got to make the most out of this embarrassing season. And he was careless. He got caught out by the Mickey Mouse chicane and cost his team points. So
Hmm.
and then
I mean,
Ferrari cost himself points. The fuel hoses.
again, it's not the topic of the day, but this was deep into when the sabotage stuff was going on, and so, and by this point, he hadn't scored any points in the last 4 races, I think.
Yeah.
So it was, yeah, it obviously was really kind of getting to him. But yeah, I think Rosberg, he said, like, he kind of jokes that to Alonso, like, oh, you cost me my first win, because I think he had to he was forced to pit twice. Well, no, he was forced to take a penalty because he had to pit during the safety car, even when the pit lane was closed, because otherwise he would have run out of fuel. And I think Barrichello and Kubica did the same thing, and then they had to take drive-through penalties because of that. And again, which is a really, they had this rule, so they would just close the pit lane in a safety car because they didn't want people pitting, I guess. And it was just an odd one because it wasn't like the accident had happened in the pit lane or on the pit exit. Again, this was one of the flaws with refueling, is that, well, you're forcing them to take a penalty by your own admission, because otherwise they're not going to finish the race. And otherwise, yeah, he maybe could have won it. But
I wish he had, because he really did drive a phenomenal race. I mean, that was the first race I looked at Nico Rosberg since his debut, and I thought, wow, this guy isn't just some. I mean, yes, he is a rich kid with a famous dad, but he really drove the wheels off that car that weekend. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, where did he? I mean, Rosberg finished second, Nakajima, and in qualifying, I mean, Nakajima was 10th, Rosberg was 9th, but there was a 1 second difference between them. Nico drove the wheels off that car, and that was definitely one of the races that I remember Nico Rosberg really showing his class. And yeah, I think ultimately it would have been nice to see that, because that would have been a proper result. The question is, like, where would Massa have finished? Would Massa have lost to Nico? Look, I'm not ready to give Felipe Massa the benefit of the doubt in pressure situations. So I'm just going to say that, maybe Massa would have won it. But again, Ferrari made a mistake. You can't just ignore that. They made a mistake in the pit stop. And at the end of the day, it didn't really change anything, because Hamilton had the momentum, in my opinion, before, and he just extended his lead at a track where Ferrari should have dominated yet again. So
it was. I remember there was controversy at the time because they were having problems in pit stops because they had that light system. So there was like a red light and a green light above the car, whereas everyone else just had the guy holding the dolly that would lift it up. And so
right.
and everyone was like, maybe they should get rid of that and make it a bit less automated, because that's what's causing the problems.
Or maybe
Yeah.
they should just make sure that the things they implement work. Unfortunately, with Ferrari, that's not always the case.
Yeah,